Do you think that we're going to hear anything from these oil executives today that would lead one to believe that they're going to do anything for consumers?
Well, I think what companies can do, what's much needed for all the actors, but especially the companies, is more investment in upstream and CapEx. But of course, they've got the same concerns that OPEC does. You know, this recession, inflationary issues, that all impacts their long-term planning. Policymakers impact their long-term planning. I mean, you can't have situations where, you know, 1 month you're lifting a ban on fracking, and then the following month you're reversing that ban. It's hard for companies to plan and do long-term investments in this type of environment. So it's really important for private companies, executives, to start thinking about what they need to make these long-term investments, because we need this supply. They need to communicate this to policymakers. Policymakers have to listen.
They got to take one on the chin, if you will.
Energy security is not a short-term thing. It's a long-term thing. And if we treat it like a short-term, we're going to see this movie over and over again.
Joe, I want your take on where you think OPEC policy is going to go from here. Just out of Saudi Arabia, we heard from His Royal Highness talking about how losing emergency stock may become more painful in the months to come, perhaps acknowledging some of the concerns around the recession and supply-side issues in the market that he's obviously looking at. Do you think that OPEC Plus is going to be in a capacity building mode from this point on, i.e. more cuts to come?
Well, I think the comments that you're referencing was definitely on this part about keeping capacity, you know, raising and maintaining capacity. I mean, Saudi Arabia in particular traditionally has liked to have, you know, about 1 million barrels a day in capacity, and we haven't had that. And you know, they like to have that, to have the ability to respond to issues like this EU sanctions that are coming up. He was probably referencing the fact that a lot of the OECD countries and other countries have participated in releases of strategic reserves as well. So I think, you know, you all know him like I know him. I mean, he's a very cautious guy. He likes to think ahead and try to anticipate, and part of that thinking is to have some remedies for problems in the future. And I think that's what he's looking at. In terms of what OPEC might do, I think they're going to be very responsive to the market. They're going to take into account the data that's being presented. If we start seeing data about a recession and reduced demand, I think they'll respond to that. If that doesn't happen, I think they will adjust. I don't think they're locked in.
Listen, when we talk about that data, not to interrupt, but I got to say, I mean, you've got to look at what the president is essentially saying there. And Antony Blinken has even said, he's like, that we shared with them the numbers. This is not a cut that they needed to make right now. But when you think about that, I mean, is it up to the Saudis or the UAE or any other OPEC member to listen to the Americans' numbers? Because if they listened to the IEA's numbers, for example, they would have stopped producing oil already.
Yeah, I mean, look, all three of the energy agencies that do monthly reports, we don't do monthly reports, but all three of them are predicting or forecasting lower demand as a result of the recession.
So the Americans' numbers have been that different?
EIA and IEA, and you know, I mean, I think the president's, you know, is obviously trying to be optimistic about the economy, and that's probably not a bad thing for a U.S. president. But certainly, I think there seems to be widespread you know, agreement that we're facing some bad economic times ahead.